Welcome, everyone. I'm Frances Hayashida, the Director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute, or LAII, at the University of New Mexico. The LAII promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as local and global discourse through programming. We'd like to first take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. Today, we're going to hear from Juan Bautista Belardi, Emily Jones, and Will Taylor about horses and humans in the Americas, archaeology and indigenous horse use from the North American West to Argentina. They will discuss how horses, mules, and donkeys flourished throughout the Americas and were widely adopted by indigenous peoples following their introduction by the Spanish after 1492. Their collaborative research uses a combination of ethnoarchaeology, collections-based zooarchaeological research, and, zooarchaeological research and archaeological science to understand how, when, and why this process took place. Today, they will explore what we know about horses and people in Western North America and in Argentina, what changes the introduction brought, their methods, and some of their preliminary results. Juan Bautista Belardi, who is joining us today from Southern Patagonia, is Professor of Archaeology at the Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia Austral in Argentina. He is a CONICET researcher who studies hunter-gatherers. His main areas of interest relate to the tempo and mode of the peopling of Southern Patagonia and landscape use through distributional analysis focused on lithic technology and archaeofaunas. Emily Jones is Associate Professor of Anthropology and a faculty affiliate of the Latin American and Iberian Institute. She is a zooarchaeologist who studies human-animal relationships in a wide variety of times and places, including Paleolithic Iberia and the pre-Hispanic and Spanish colonial American Southwest/Mexican Northwest. Will Taylor is Assistant Professor and Curator of Archaeology at the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History in Boulder, Colorado. He is a zooarchaeologist specialized in the study of animal domestication with a particular focus on horses and their impact on human societies around the globe, from the Eurasian steppes to the Pampas and the Great Plains. So please join me in welcoming Professors Belardi, Jones, and Taylor.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction, Frances, and thank you so much everyone for being here today. I'm super excited. This is we're having such global participation, and I'm really looking forward to when we get to the panel discussion part of this. So I hope we can have a really good conversation. So what's going to happen today? My colleagues and I want to share with you a little bit about our current work on the spread of the horse in the Americas, North and South. I should say to start, we are just 3 of a much larger team working on this question. So we have partners at a whole suite of institutions, including University of Oklahoma, University of Toulouse, University of Arizona. We have other partners here at UNM, as well as in Argentina, some of whom are here today. And we are always looking for people to work with. So I want to say right up front, if you want to be involved with this project in any way, please reach out to one of us. We're really excited to talk to pretty much anyone who's interested in this question. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start by giving a very brief presentation about our project, and Will and Juan, I hope you will jump in as we go along. Sometimes I'll pass it over, but please just bring up anything you want to say, and I'll stop back. Same to everyone else. If you have questions as we go along, please go ahead and feel free to type them into the chat. I have the chat box up, or you can just type your name too if you have something to
Emily,
say.
I can also, because you're going to be presenting, I can sort of MC the questions so that they don't I don't know, maybe you're good at not getting derailed, but I always get derailed in mid thought when I see the chat thing go. So I'll filter those. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay. Okay, so we have this short presentation, but we're hoping that the bulk of the time we can spend in a panel discussion, just talking about some of the issues involved with horses and humans in the Americas. Okay, so the Horses and Human Societies project that we're talking about today, it has its origins in an observation. Horses are really integral to our conception of the Americas, whether we're talking about, I need to make sure this is advancing, whether we're talking about how best to manage wild horses, or the symbolism associated with cowboys in North America and gauchos in South America, or whether we're talking about the role of horses in indigenous cultures across the Americas. No matter which of these things we're talking about, horses are really part of how we see ourselves. But horses were not always in the Americas. Even though the genus Equus originally evolved in North America, it went extinct here at the end of the Pleistocene. And horse domestication itself actually took place in interior Asia sometime prior to 2000 BCE. And then there was a point after this where horses were trained to pull chariots. Sometime after this, horseback riding developed. There are lots of arguments back and forth about the precise dates when these things happened. But what we can say is that once horses were trained to pull chariots by at least 1500 BCE, we start seeing horses spreading across Asia, into Europe, and even into Northern Africa. And along the way, these animals facilitated mass migrations of people, but they also facilitated warfare. Chariot-based warfare, it was a huge part of Bronze Age Eurasia, and is one example. So we can put it simply, horses really changed the history of Eurasia. And a lot of the research that's out there on the horse focuses on this particular process. And this is in fact one of Will's areas of specialty. So he may want to jump in on some of it. But we would argue, in fact, that the spread of horses and donkeys too, to the rest of the world, to Australia, to South Africa, to the Americas, maybe this was even more important, even though it gets a lot less attention in general discussions about horses and horse domestication. Okay, so horses returned to the Americas with Christopher Columbus in 1493. They were brought to Hispaniola first, and then later to other parts of the Americas, with ever larger numbers brought by different conquistadors on different expeditions. So the Coronado expedition, for example, in 1540, it's one event by which we know that horses entered North America. Between this initial reintroduction and the 19th century is when horses became so important in the Americas. In the North American West, for instance, horses spurred the development of what are sometimes called horse nations, indigenous groups that developed lifeways based on horseback riding. So the Comanche is a very famous example of this. So this here, what's on the screen is an Edward Curtis photograph taken in the early 20th century, and it's a really romanticized image, but the fact that it is such a romanticized image and that it was so popular gets the point across that horses became really important to indigenous peoples in North America. Even outside horse cultures, horses allowed changes in land use. They were a means of communication. Sometimes they were a source of food. A similar process took place in Argentina, and Juan, I hope you'll jump in here as to add on. As in North America, horses facilitated changes in subsistence. They were a food source as well as changing how people hunted. They spurred changes in land use and technology, and they were connected to hide processing. Juan, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
I would rather prefer to do it at the end of the presentation.
Okay. Okay.
The presentation of the slides. Thank you.
This sounds good. Okay. So horses facilitated capture of morquanajo, a camelid, which is a major prey species, and this led into the hide trade and hide processing, and in fact had some technological impacts as well, which is something we can come back to. Okay, so to this point, I have been talking about what we know happened with the reintroduction of the horse. How do we know this happened? Well, the fact is that most of our knowledge on this topic has traditionally come from historic records, documents created by the Spanish and by other Europeans about what they saw. And documents are super useful. Okay, there's a lot of super important information that they provide. So, for example, maps, quantities, locations, presence and absence of horses in particular places, these are all things that we can and have learned from documents. But even at their best, historic records, they limit our thinking in some ways. There are a lot of things that they don't provide us with an understanding of. So for instance, we don't know how horses were being used in these locations. So they can't really tell us how the horse came to be so important. And maybe most importantly, they only tell us about changes that occurred in those places where records were being made. So they're telling us about changes in the places where Europeans were present. They can't tell us about what was happening everywhere else. And that is likely where some of the most important changes were going on.
I'll add with that, Emily, the historic records related to the adoption of horses often really can't even do the absence part very well. It's usually maybe better characterized as presence, but are particularly notorious for their missing that absence piece, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Will. Okay, so this gets us to thinking about archaeology. Archaeology is really helpful in many situations where the documents are unsatisfactory, but there's a challenge with it when it comes to horses, and it's really it really comes down to the ephemeral nature of a lot of archaeological sites that are associated with horse cultures. In general, these sites are often very insubstantial. Cultures that rely on the horse are frequently, although not always, extremely nomadic. And because they move around so much, they often don't leave a whole lot behind. Despite this, we do sometimes get horses in archaeological sites and sometimes burials, as on the right-hand side of the screen at the moment. And it is on these archaeological horses that we do recover from archaeological sites that we've been focusing. We've got a number of tools we can use on this particular material. So for instance, what we see up here is some of the ways in which looking at horse morphology we can use to understand things about how horses were used for particular types of transport. And this is all from Will's work. And so again, Will, if you want to jump in and talk about any of this in more detail, please go ahead and do so. You can see up here that there's that certain deformations of the skull can tell us about bit wear, about nose bands, and about exertion.
I just think, just to the confused viewers, I think a couple of the images here might have gotten stacked over top of each other, so they might not be super understandable, those noseband and middle bit ones.
Okay, so another set of evidence set of evidences that we can look at have to do with so demography can be used to understand things like herd management. Will and some of his colleagues have worked on identifying veterinary care and also castration from archaeological remains, which is another aspect of herd management. The another line. Sorry, I have had some issues with my notes here. Okay, it's under control. Radiocarbon dating of remains. This is the next thing that I wanted to talk about. This is a way by by doing direct dating on some of these horse remains, it's a way that we can get a sense of when horses were showing up in particular locations. And we're going to come back to this with some newer data towards the end of the talk as we get more in depth. But just to give you a sense of some of the dates we've been looking at thus far, we see a pattern that looks a little bit like this. We can tie this in with records and oral histories along with other archaeological data. To tie this again to known paleoenvironmental records and to cultural events and historical events to get a sense of the entire context of horse introduction and spread. I am not going to get into this particular slide in too much detail, but I did want to mention that isotopic studies is one line of evidence that we've been using to get a sense of whether animals are being foddered or let to free graze, and we'll come back to this one again too. And then I want to mention DNA, because DNA studies have been a really important component of this work too. They can provide information on everything from what the source population of particular horses was to information such as coat color. So these different types of evidence are allowing us to get at some of the juicy questions, the really big questions that the documentary record can't get us to. Things like, how were early horses managed, bred, and used by Spanish colonists and by indigenous people? How did the use of horses, donkeys, and mules impact colonial and Native American societies? And then, this is really one of the bigger ones, what was the timing and nature of the geographic spread of the horse into North and South America? Okay, so we're going to give a couple examples here. Will, do you want to talk about the Kaw River horse a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think it might be fun to kind of operationalize a little bit of what we're talking about just with a couple of examples that highlight the ways that archaeology can tell us different kinds of information than might be out there in the historic records and in the body of existing work that's the significant body of existing work that's been done on studying the introduction of the horse. And we've chosen here one example that's really nice because it highlights all the things that we can learn from even just from a single horse specimen, and that our work is, potentially hoping to aggregate over time into answering bigger picture questions. But B, it also shows us just how much of this record has been missed in the past through some sort of understandable oversights that I think have applied to much of the archaeological record of horses in North America and likely South America as well. So this is a specimen we're going to highlight here from an archaeological site right in the middle of Lawrence, Kansas. So if you've ever been to the university, the main river there is alternatively known as the Kaw or Kansas River, which runs basically right through Lawrence. And I'll let Emily cycle me forward a bit here. And at some point in the early 20th century, an entire intact skull of a horse came sort of eroding out of the riverbank. And this river is actually known for kicking out all kinds of nice Ice Age megafaunal fossils. Just a few meters away, they found at the same time a big leg of a ancient bison, right? So the paleontologists at the time can be easily forgiven for thinking that they had found a beautiful Ice Age horse, and it was even given its own species name, which was appropriately titled Equus laurentius, after the city's name there. But go ahead, Emily. A reevaluation of this specimen with a couple of radiocarbon dates, both by the paleontologist Eric Scott and then with some follow-up work by us, has identified that in fact, despite this horse coming straight out of a kind of a Ice Age deposit, is very clearly dates to the middle or early part of the 17th century, which actually is earlier than by several decades than many kind of historical record focused models would even place horses in this region, much less in an indigenous context. Now, because this is immaculately preserved, there's all sorts of information about this specific horse's life that we can and have learned from it. And I'll just kind of cycle through a couple of these pieces. So one of these things is because you know, the horse was so well preserved, we had the entire dentition, and we were able to selectively remove a single tooth from this horse's jaw, which then by iteratively sampling different sections of the enamel, we're able to kind of reconstruct a year in the life, if you will, of this animal's kind of dietary inputs that are sort of encoded in the stable isotope values in that enamel. And again, this is not probably the venue to go too deep into the weeds with this. And I don't know if we put an animation or if I forgot here, but basically what our results show is that suggest that perhaps in the winter season, this horse all of a sudden went from eating primarily horsey dry grass to something that very well could be maize, right? An indigenous domestic plant that perhaps folks were feeding to kind of get this horse through a tough winter. So this is our unpublished but ongoing work on the biomolecular side of things. Go ahead. On the osteological side of things, you know, the skeleton of a horse is this, just like the skeleton of you and I, right, is this beautiful chronicle of everything that's happened to it that was serious enough to cause problems in the bone, right? And so through a kind of analysis of this very well preserved skeletal material, we've been able to learn a lot of things about how this horse was used by ancient people. And one of the first things, in fact, identified by the paleontologists the second group of paleontologists who looked at this horse, was damage to the teeth, the lower second premolars, which is pretty characteristic of using a bridle mouthpiece, right, that we would call a bit, right? And so it's actually been so severe that it wore away not only the kind of cementum that covers the exterior of the tooth, but also all the way through the very hard enamel plating inside of that. So this is good evidence that the horse was controlled with a metal bit, right? Which in this time period indicates that horses and horse equipment, right, were both sort of reaching this region from some Spanish source at some point, right, or other European source. Go ahead. Through the skeleton, though, we can learn some other things. And one of the osteological problems that also presented on this horse was kind of an arthritic damage to where the jaw connects with the skull. And we suspect that this kind of problem is actually telling us something about the way that the bridle technology of that horse was ridden with worked. And if you go to the next slide, you can see specifically what we mean here. And that is, you know, in the 17th century, Spanish and many other European bits were actually what you might call a curb bit, right? The reins attached to these long shanks, which are then leveraging along the lower jaw when the reins are pulled. And probably it's the chronic use of this type of bit, which is causing all kinds of downward action on the jaw, which produced this skeletal issue. So go ahead. And this is a little schematic here of you know, the suspected areas where this type of bit might actually cause different kinds of damage to the skull. And we're pulling on a lot of other things here that we're not going to get into, but just needless to say that essentially this horse displays all of these changes that could conceivably be linked to this style of horse equipment. So by, because we have this great preservation, we can actually essentially reconstruct in quite nice detail the kind of equipment that was used. And this is just another example, damage to the fragile kind of palate bones of the skull, right, which are also caused by, if you jump back a slide, you can see this this little scheme here, right, the way that bit actually pushes upwards on the roof of the mouth. And then finally, through our 3D scanning, we actually identified what may be some evidence of blunt trauma to the horse's skull, and not the kind that might have been used to sort of slaughter the horse, right? So this sort of depression that you see here could be evidence that the horse was, for lack of a better term, clubbed in the head during some kind of conflict, right? And so we may even be seeing evidence of that impact of the horse, broader impact of the horse socially in things like warfare, for example, materializing all in this single specimen, which through radiocarbon dating and through our knowledge of when the horse was recovered, putting some simple parameters, we can actually date quite precisely to the middle of the 17th century. So I think that's all we had to say about this. Did you want to take back over, Emily, or?
I think do you want to talk about this particular slide, since I think this one.
Yeah.
This
okay.
one
So I mean, this little animation here basically just shows if we're summarizing some of the broader findings, preliminary findings of our work. This Kaw horse is just one of now a growing handful, and in fact, there are more even than are shown on this slide, of early horse remains from across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, which are providing scientifically dated evidence of indigenous management and use of horses, sometimes in really striking detail, that predate the kind of standard historical document-based chronology for when we think that indigenous folks might have gotten domestic horse. This is all information that's coming from this kind of interdisciplinary archaeology. And why is it important that we pin this down to a matter of, a few decades, right? What's the difference, for example, between, horses reaching the Northern Plains in 1650 versus 1750? Well, one big one, right, is that there was a huge amount of widespread social and economic changes that took place, in the 17th and 18th century, some of them of a continental scale. And just one example highlighted here is the movement of the Comanche, right, from their homeland somewhere in, the southern stretches of Wyoming, kind of Shoshonean-speaking group, down into, New Mexico, into the Southern Plains, Colorado and Texas and Llano Estacado. That migration is often characterized as the Comanche came to the Southwest and they got horses. Well, this work might suggest, in fact, that it was the transition to a horse-based way of life, right, that motivated this kind of essentially transcontinental or at least Estados Unidos movement of people for in a way that represents the reorientation of life to fit the horse, or to suit the changes that are kind of introduced by horses. So it's just one small example of the way that this approach might ultimately end up giving us some big picture restructuring of how horses were introduced into this part of the continent, and how we think about their impacts and their integration into indigenous societies.
Thank you, Will. This is great. Okay, so now we're on to talking about the Patagonian example. And Juan, maybe you can talk a little bit about the site of Chorrillo Grande.
Yes, thank you. Chorrillo Grande is, let's say, a very unusual site for Patagonia. It is located in the southern tip of Patagonia at the Rio Gallegos middle basin in the north shore. And it's really, we found a very broad distribution of archaeological material. Bone horses, yes, are not the most important part of the archaeological component, but the one from guanaco bones. So there are no archaeological sites in Patagonia where horse bones prevail. The prevailing fauna is always the one from guanacos. The site is also characterized by the presence of lithic projectile points, lithic sherds, iron nails, and glass scrapers. And to have all this kind of evidence together, as I said, it's really rare. When you invite me to participate in this talk, I start thinking about the differences between the Patagonian archaeological record and the one you can find at the Great Plains, and I took some notes on that. I will read them because it will be easier for me. First of all, the incorporation of the horse opened a new niche for the resident populations. Both regions have similar adoption times. Anyway, in North America, people saw Coronado coming, to say in this way, because in Patagonia, nothing like this took place. There were not such entradas in Patagonia. The horses that reached Patagonia came mostly sure from the ones left in Buenos Aires province by the Spanish crown, the Spanish conquerors, when when Buenos Aires was founded around 1580. Societies in North America and in Patagonia, in North America I'm referring to the Great Plains, strongly differed. In Patagonia, all people were hunter-gatherers and with a very low demography. So the human demographic base was very different. A lot of people in North America and quite few and very few in Patagonia. And this has important consequences. To mention some changes in mobility are strictly worth noting. While in North America, mobility increased, in Patagonia decreased, but home ranges become larger. As noted by Moreno, too, marine resources were abandoned or left or felt in the resource ranking. It has to be highlighted that semi-sedentary people in North America became highly mobile. So there is a very different picture in North America than the one you can find in Patagonia. In North America, main prey, the bison, was almost drove to extinction, while nothing like this occurred with the guanaco in Patagonia. So here you have another difference. In a related way, horses reach at least 1 million in North America, and even when, as far as I know, there is not such counting in Patagonia, these high numbers have no historical support. Another difference. One thing that North America and Patagonia share is skin commerce. Can you please, Emily, go to one of the first slides where glass scrapers were shown? Sorry about that. Thank you. Here you
It's
can
okay.
see.
I'm sorry it took me so long.
Oh, no. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for doing you going forth. There you have at the center of the middle of the slide, at the center of the slide, the glass scrapers. In a research conducted together with Amalia Nuevo de Loné, we found that this explosion in the frequencies of glass scrapers could be related to the explosion of skin guanaco exploitation done by hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers using horses. So this is a related process between guanaco hunting, horses, hide and cloaks production in order to commerce them and to send all this production to Europe from Patagonian ports like Punta Arenas in the southern tip in the Magellan Strait. So when we are talking about historical sites in southern Patagonia, when we are talking about the Welchi sites in Patagonia, the very familiar evidence that came into our minds are glass scrapers. No, not horse bones, because there are not so few horse bones. And why could be this so? I was thinking about it when we talked with Emily several times. I reinforce the point that horses have to be seen as unstable too. But where are the bones? If you're talking about the stable, the expectation is to find bones at campsite. There are not so many bones. Actually, there are no bones at all when you find, for example, glass scrapers. Probably this could be related to the way that horses are kept and the way that horses are considered in the social Welchi media. If, for example, horses are keeping at the open air, horses die not in the camps. So probably meat was stripped off and transported to the camps. We have to think that dealing with horses with horses as staple is like thinking about processing megafauna. So the expectation to find transported bones when horses die far from the campsites, from the sites, it's not a solid expectation. What I expect is not to find bones at all, and the bones that we could find, there will have no cut marks or a very low frequency of cut marks. So probably horses could be related more to transport or to hunting prestige than to a staple. They were used as staple, but in certain ways. For example, actually, horses are consumed by gauchos in southern Patagonia, but when? Not every day, not always, but in special social gatherings like national feasts or gaucho feast, gaucho reunions. So in very special social occasions, horses are consumed. So this is the the small window that horse bones had to get introduced into the archaeological record. It's a very narrow window for me. That's the couple of ideas I have in mind.
Oh, this is great. Thank you. Will, do you want to add
Yeah,
on?
could you cycle back to the Chorrillo Grande slide? And
Yeah,
Emily,
give me a
just wants
sec.
to bring your attention to a question/observation that we have in the comments. But just to quickly follow up on a very important point made by Dr. Belardi, which is that one of the reasons behind this bias, the sort of failure to integrate zooarchaeological data into our understanding of the horse, right, is not because people didn't think about it. It's because oftentimes the archaeological record looks exactly like something like you would see on this slide. A small number, limited fragments of horse bone, because horses, unless they were an important part of the diet, often don't enter the archaeological record in the same way that other maybe domestic animals or other kinds of, guanacos or other animals might. And when they're entering, it's often in ones and twos, in isolated teeth and bone. And so our project has finally, I think, managed to embrace this, right, by applying some of the kind of emerging biomolecular techniques that we have. For example, a little bone like this can now give us, with a little bit of shotgun sequencing, can give us a DNA-based result that might not be a genomic sequence, but it might be a probabilistic determination of, was this a male or a female horse? Was this a donkey, or a mule or a horse? These kind of data points are getting cheaper and easier to integrate into an archaeological research design. And they now allow us to get something meaningful analytically out of this really rare, but often poorly preserved and low quantity amount of material, and start to build up these big picture models out of, one bone from one site may not seem like a lot if your goal is to learn great detail about that one site. But if you do it 20, 30 times over the size of a half of a continent, right, you can start to pick out bigger, more meaningful patterns. And I think that's one niche that we're hoping to step into with this work. Okay, and then
Yeah. So, and I see this
question.
Yeah, we have this great comment in the chat about the historical information in the Sonora Desert, the Tohono O'odham record. Riva Mariah Shield Chief, would you be willing to talk a little bit about this?
Okay, so I apologize. I'm eating lunch. My mom has the TV on and it's really loud, but basically, I just wanted to make that observation, is that because I go to the University of Arizona, and I've taught at the Tohono Community College, and as such, a part of the Tohono history and culture class requires, of course, that we talk about Father Kino. And we know that when he came, he brought a lot of very important things into the culture, which was steel tools, and then there are, of course, the winter crops that we have here that added to our traditional crops, and then also horses, cattle, pigs. And with the majority of that, cattle were seen as a food source. Horses mostly were not, and because of the unfamiliarity of the Spanish with the landscape, essentially, they didn't have the huge and easy access to water. And so it wasn't until later on, and we're talking when actual cattle ranching became a thing for us as a people, that horses became more integrated into the society.
Thank you so much. That's super interesting. And it's pointing to one of the interesting things that we've been looking at, which is the difference so the horses may have been there early, but when did they become important? And that does in fact seem to have varied quite a lot with specific circumstances. We have another question in the chat, which might be one for you, Will, more than for anyone else. Did the Spanish introduce the so-called Andalusian horse, another breed? What can you tell us about breeds of horses?
One of the things that this type of research immediately evokes is big debates and discussions about Spanish ancestry, about some of these, different horse breeds. What is the connection between the early indigenous horses and the barbs of Spain or of Northern Africa? This is a question that we think is well suited to our full genome sequencing, and it's something that not every archaeological specimen is able to really provide a detailed answer on. But as we go about this work, we are starting to build a data set of archaeological horse remains from both Spanish colonial and indigenous contexts across a pretty large swath of the American West, and we hope to start doing the same in Argentina, that then allow us to compare, with our partners at the University of Toulouse. They've really accumulated a pretty impressive reference data set of things like 17th century horses from Spain or from different parts of Europe. I do think eventually we might be able to give a more nuanced answer to this. So far, what our work has shown, though, is that conclusively that the horses that made it early into the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains were clearly very closely related to Iberian horses, right? At this point, I don't think we can really say specifically about different Iberian variants and this sort of thing, but it's clear that Iberian horses had a big impact, and I suspect that as we continue this kind of work, we'll get to answer a bit more nuance about the geography and the characteristics of the original Spanish horses. But more interesting to us in many ways is how those horses changed in indigenous societies, right? Rather than, I think there can be an element of sort of glorified celebration of the Spanish when we talk about horses, and really what our project is more interested in is how did those inputs become something uniquely kind of indigenous, right? And we really want to answer that as well. So the emergence of indigenous breeds from those original horses is a key question that we hope, stay tuned for a lot of the answers to this, because I think as the data sets accumulate, we'll be able to answer them better and better.
Okay, and there's a great additional question related to this, and I think it gets at one of the things that we don't have as much information on at this point, but it's one that we're trying to get into. Kelsey, John, do you want to share this or speak a little bit about your question, or I can just read it?
Hi, yeah, I will, and I was laying on my floor TV. So yeah, I just have a question about some of the oral histories and even the ceremonial histories and contexts in Native communities that actually tell a really different temporal narrative of the horse. So looking at like whether it's a timeline of introduction or even just like the significance of the horse in relationship to land and indigenous communities in ceremonial context. So I'm just wondering, like, because there's a vast amount of research and just like oral histories that really tell a different narrative of the horse, in fact, as not being introduced at all in this space. So I would just wonder how you all are in conversation with that or would speak to that.
I can take this one, Emily, unless you would like to.
Go for it. I'll jump in as needed.
This is a very, very complicated question, right? Because one of the things, the research, the things that's undeniably true about the state of research into the introduction of horses that has preceded us, right, is that there is a hard edge of undervaluing of indigenous narratives. There is a European centrism that gives incomplete, incorrect, and unfair sort of perspective about when were horses introduced. Is an absolute fact that those, traditional historic narrative tends to cheapen, shorten, and make less significant the antiquity of indigenous relationships with horses. And in response to that, right, many scholars have engaged with that starting point, and in a rightful and well argued, counterpoint to that, have highlighted the ways in which those approaches really don't measure up to the truth. Now, there is this question, right, of were horses reintroduced or not? And I think that a focus on that question as a point of, an overemphasis on that particular question as the sort of major discussion misses the more significant point, which is can this archaeological science approach restore the truths that indigenous oral histories have really known for quite some time and have been, sort of raising their hand like, hey, there's this incomplete and biased component of this work that is really minimizing the antiquity of our relationship with the horse. And so what I would say is that our work does show that very clearly that the horses that we find in early indigenous contexts, right, they're not related in any genomic sense to the last ones that were here in the Pleistocene, right? Now, that being said, we have also openly embraced the kinds of information that we can learn from these indigenous narratives. And one of our most valuable partnerships now has been with Dr. Yvette Running Horse Collin, who I think is perhaps the most widely known advocate of the kind of alternative hypothesis, right, that horses, were independently domesticated here in the States. And she's actually become a postdoctoral fellow in the genomics lab of our collaborators here, right? She's a Lakota woman who has a very deep knowledge of horses and their role in Plains indigenous cultures. And she's highlighted some really, really significant oversights in, the predominantly European or Euro-American kind of scientific approach to this topic that I think are absolutely crucial. And what our work tends to show is that all these, indigenous traditions which say, hey, this relationship with horses is much older than any of you are recognizing in the scientific community. Our work is really supporting those arguments quite well. And I think that that work that is able to, on the one hand, embrace the kind of techniques that we have that are developing through scientific technology, through DNA, through biomolecular work, that is able to partner those in a meaningful way with indigenous communities, and which is able to embrace indigenous traditions, is going to be, that approach is going to be the one that gets us to the truth. So obviously that's a long-winded, complicated answer to a question that's not easy to answer. But it's our opinion that there is something of value in both approaches, and if we can find a way to bring them together, I think the results will be one that, in general, reinforce to this Western science community the value of those indigenous traditions, which you're right, they will give us a different perspective than one that's historically been represented in that sphere. Does that?
Yeah. And I just want to add on there and say thank you for raising that question, because it is, in fact, this is a really big part of the story, and there is an explicit arm of our project. And I'm sorry that the folks who are leading that aspect of it couldn't be here today to talk a little bit about the ethnographic aspect of the work we're doing. But yeah, it's a really important question. And again, thank you so much for asking.
We have a lot of backlog of questions here. Emily,
Yes, we do.
I don't know how you want to move to this point.
Well, maybe we can move to the. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, just one more point on horses as staples. And this came from the taphonomic point of view. We are dealing with big and thick bones with no deep chronology. So from this standpoint, the expectation is the horse bones to be found, and we don't found them. So probably this reinforces. I think that this reinforces the idea that horses were not a main staple. And two more things I was thinking about when I was hearing you was that the adoption of the horse increases the circulation of goods, for example. And in Patagonia, this is worth noting because there are founds of Mapuche ornaments from northern Patagonia in the southern side of Patagonia, and this is related to the horse circulation. Also, the very same is seen in the painted cloaks, in the designs of the painted cloaks. All they look like northern designs, and this is related with the horse, that the mobility provided by the horse. And one more point about horse historic sites and interaction between different populations is that the horse mostly speed up the vectors of death as was proposed. I'm referring to Ramenovsky's idea about vectors of death. And so probably the diminishing population of aborigines are also related to the introduction of the horse. From the one side, it opens a new niche, but from the other side, it introduces death between their social systems.
I noticed a couple of questions here, actually focusing, kind of following up on this question about mobility, right? And what, the potential reasons for these differences. That I think it's one of the most interesting things that I've heard is Dr. Belardi's insights in comparing, how the impact of the horse might have differed between, areas of Patagonia and the Great Plains. And it's something that often gets missed in our broad discussions. When people talk about horses, there's often this very hard-grooved narrative about horses got introduced and it increased mobility. And one thing I think the value about this kind of, multi-regional comparative approach is that it helps us reach a more nuanced understanding of how and why that actually is or isn't the case. I think one thing that jumped out to me in thinking about that question and in thinking about the comments of Dr. Belardi may be that the introduction of horses altered mobility for everyone, sure, and it certainly gave people the ability to travel farther. But what impact did it have on ecology, on the society, on an economy? I'd say the universal thread that could be tied through that would be it made it more horse-like, right? For the people that were, you know, mostly sedentary horticulturalists, integrating horses more directly into their economy probably meant moving more than they were used to, right? For a mobile hunter-gatherer that might have moved extremely long distances, you know, in a particular, you know, pre-horse economy, horses, despite their speed, are surprisingly territorial, right? I mean, they don't, you introduce horses into a virgin landscape, and the way they're going to colonize it may be that, you know, the one band of horses sets up in their territory, and the next one gets kicked out and makes their territory at the next spot that they can find. But they're very nuclear in their behavior, right? And so it may be that becoming a horse pastoral economy doesn't necessarily make a group exceedingly mobile, right? And the role, you know, that the introduction of horses played in any given group requires a fair amount of nuanced understanding of, you know, its, you know, existing ecological and economic patterns, and, you know, what are the incentives, how are horses being used, and, you know, are they being, you know, raised for specific purposes? Are they part of a broader economy? Are folks raising them primarily for their own subsistence? I mean, all these things are being juggled at once, and I hope that this kind of comparative work will help us hone in on what some of those important changes might be in the future.
I wonder if I might inject a very short comment here. I just got out of a seminar that was organized by the University of Indiana, where they were discussing herding in Central Asia. And as early as the late 3rd millennium BC, there was a problem with environmental degradation from herding of cattle and ovicaprids and horses. And this contributed to the degree of mobility. I'll get off the stage right away, but I think that might be relevant to your discussion, Professor Taylor.
Just for all those who are listening, that question was from Dr. Peter Kalekna, author of literally who wrote the book on this subject. So I'm very, I think if anybody's in a position to answer any of these questions, it's probably her. So thank you so much for attending and for your thoughtful question. I think you're very right that one of the key things to consider in terms of any discussion of mobility is environmental processes, right? And the horse and other domestic livestock were, while all of these changes were happening, were instigating enormous ecological and environmental changes. Some of it degradation, some of it simple, you know, might be better characterized as just response. But it's really crucial to incorporate those into our thinking. And unfortunately, we really can't do that very well without a well-dated empirical kind of record for when horses arrived somewhere, in what numbers, and how. And so that's part of the logic behind the radiocarbon dating component, is to see if we can build a kind of empirical, you know, data set that would let us do a better job of connecting to, you know, paleo-environmental records and kind of sussing those things out. I think Emily has more to say.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add on that there's another environmental factor, particularly with the situation with the horse coming in the Americas, and likely in South America too. And it goes back to Dr. Belardi was talking about the concept of vectors of death. So one of the another project that I have been working on with a number of other scholars has to do with the possibility, because of demographic impacts of the introduction of European diseases, the fact that we may have actually seen a large human population decrease, which may in and of itself have caused some environmental rebound, for lack of a better term. There are some real problems with the term rebound, but that also may be playing in here to some degree, and making things a bit more complicated. We have a ton of great questions in here, and I am not really sure how to approach them.
So I think one good thing to get clarification on is how much time we might have. I mean, we could try to summarize and pull out common threads, or we could just kind of work our way through the list depending on how much time we have remaining. Do we have any
Marlene,
guidance on that?
Francis?
Yeah, Marlene.
We actually had not discussed that ahead of time.
Okay,
But,
I mean,
but probably, other folks are, may have things that they have to go to. I wonder if there might be a way of summarizing, some of the questions or grouping them to be able to hit most people's main inquiries.
Let's see. So there were a couple of follow-up questions that were about the Kaw River horse and its significance. One comment related to whether or not it may have been an escaped animal related to the early expeditions, and that idea is actually really common in what we're finding in all of these isolated horse burials, whether it be from Kansas or Wyoming. People, the original folks who found it as a one-off incident, say, "Hey, it just so happens we have a horse from this, single unique event." But the issue is that as these things are accumulating, there's a big pattern here, and the pattern seems to be a regional one, and it seems to show indigenous management rather than accidents, right, at a pretty broad scale. And so that's a good observation, but I think our work is, over time starting to suggest there might be more at play here. There was another question specifically about the blunt trauma and how we can interpret it. A very thoughtful and appropriate comment that, it could be any individual injury, such as getting, knocked in the head, could be from something totally innocuous, right? It could have been a kick in the head from another horse. Although it's worth saying that even a kick in the head from a horse is not something you often find in a wild horse skeleton, right? That is often sort of indirectly related to being confined, in close quarters with other animals, or but the only way around this is to really do these kind of population level assessments of things like, trauma or some of these issues where we're looking for larger patterning rather than, specifically diving too deep into an individual interpretation. I also want to thank Denny Seymour for sending a fantastic reference that's
I'm going to jump in here too, just because I have a question for Dr. Taylor and Dr. Belardi. We did have someone who would like to contact, and I've put my email up there. You're always welcome to contact me.
Yeah, please put mine as well.
Is it okay for both of you? I'll put both of your contact. Okay, I will do that.
Absolutely.
My name is Christopher Chavez. I'm from Santo Domingo, Pueblo. I'm a direct descendant among the indigenous Pueblo people. We have a lot of history here, and I'd like to do some work with you, ladies and gentlemen, concerning this. Dr. Ann Romanowski, I appreciate you attending this meeting, but you are one of my professors, and I wrote this story about the horse and the Pueblo Indians, and I'd like to offer it sometime to the anthropology department, Dr. Emily Jones, and I appreciate you listening to me. And I have about 2 pages of notes that I would like to offer, but time limited. I will write my own anthology on this and hand it over to you, Dr. Jones. Thank you.
Mr. Chavez, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to listen to our thoughts. And we will be absolutely honored and thrilled to have a deeper discussion with you. I think all of us would really appreciate your notes and your input in a whatever format you would like to give. If you'd like to have a longer face-to-face individual chat with us, if you'd like to contact us by email or by phone, I mean, we would really appreciate that. And so I'll send you, or if you would be willing to send one of us an email, or I can reach out to you separately after the talk. But we really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we will really look forward to your insights, because again, just I feel the same way as when getting asked the question by Pita Kalekna. You know, your wisdom and your understanding, your information, you should probably be the one here, you know, talking and sharing with others. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes,
All
thank
of you
you.
have
We
so
must.
much ambition and so much information. You have my congratulations, really.
Thank you much to both of you.
Thank you.
So I have a request here. I'm going to put our addresses. I have a screen that I'm sharing that should be showing our addresses, but I'm also just going to put them in the chat. So I see those coming through. I just want to back to follow up on Will, reiterate what he just said. Thank you so much. Truly appreciate this. It's just what we hope from doing this kind of talk, that we'll get to connect with lots of people with really important things to say.
Emily, can you blow up the font size there? I think many people would appreciate that.
Yep. Now I've blown it up too much.
Just that's ELJ in case that part is tricky because of the L versus I.
Okay. This is a
And I messed this up too.
Oh, you muted yourself somehow. Emily has this computer issue where sometimes she randomly goes mute, and it happens every time we have a work meeting. And so I don't know how long it takes to come back, but I can feel the airtime until that happens. I think we've answered most of the lingering questions. Some of you I know got summarized because there were many that were kind of on a similar theme. So if there are other folks that are that have a really pressing question that didn't get answered, please go ahead and raise your voice now, or you can type in the chat if you prefer. Okay, so there were a few questions here that I think I can get with a single broad stroke here, which is, one is the sort of where are we coming up with timelines, and two is, you know, what is the role, how can we actually build in other kinds of information, whether they be historical sources or you know, indigenous traditions. How can you build that into a model that's something like a radiocarbon date? And one of the tools we hope to use, I mean, again, we're still really in the early stages of this, is to use Bayesian modeling, which allows you to do things like assumptions. For example, you know, you might have a story which said that, you know, horses were adopted before this event that we could, you know, link to a calendar date, right? Like the Pueblo Revolt, right? And we can build that into a constraint that then says we have this radiocarbon date that has a stretch of 200-300 calibrated years, but we're also going to incorporate this historical observation or this, you know, oral tradition, which gives us additional information that we can use to then narrow what that radiocarbon date says. And then those are the kind of things that you saw visualized when we had a little flash of a map, right? These little circles. That's basically a radiocarbon date being constrained by some other kinds of information. And sometimes it might just be we know this horse was found in 1910, so it can't be from 1920, right? I mean, sometimes they can be very simple, but sometimes they can be more broad, more complex, and we hope that maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years or after we started to really get a really better understanding of the historical record of indigenous traditions and working with partners that are able to kind of lead the charge based on their own deep knowledge of a particular region, that we might actually be able to use radiocarbon modeling for mapping in a way that also builds in these other kinds of information directly. So that's the hope. Who knows exactly how well it will work or when it will bear fruit if it does work. But we're started to do it in a limited way, site by site, right? If we have one horse here and we have some information about this region, that's how we're trying to work. And then over time, we hope that we'll be able to do bigger picture stories. But
if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank all of you for a fantastic talk and for answer. I mean, the section on answering the questions was also really, really interesting. So thank you all. Thank you everyone who's attending from across the U.S. and South America. So thank you. So Zoom round of applause for everyone.
yeah, a huge thank you to everyone. I am really blown away by the number of folks. I see so many familiar names. Hi, Rob Bozell. I just saw you now. So many familiar names and faces, and many people that I did not know. But I'm really honored that you took the time to talk with us about our research from all over the world, from Tierra del Fuego, to Colorado and beyond. So.
Yes, just let me second that. Truly grateful, and I really hope that that we will hear from you some more. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to just have the questions go on all night. This has been super interesting for me and super exciting as just to hear people's comments.